So, welcome back to the session on Subaltern Studies. We are looking at this essay, uh, Subaltern Studies and Historiography, the essay by Dipesh Chakravarti. And we were looking at how Subaltern Studies came as an important intervention in the specific context of late 70s and 80s, where it made an intervention by critiquing the Cambridge School and the Indian nationalist school. So we were talking about how Guha argued in his work on peasant struggles, how the subalterns, possessed a kind of autonomy, and this and their understanding or their ideology which were kind of branded as pre-political, okay, needs to be re-examined. So that was the kind of things that we were discussing in the previous class. Let us continue with this essay. So so the whole debate, what Dipesh Chakravarti looks at it is here how Guha himself had, at least in his earlier writings, had some of these Marxian terminologies that comes in picture. So the lingering existence of feudal type relations in the Indian scene could be read, as indeed does Guha at the beginning of his quote, as a mark of the incompleteness of the transition to capitalism. By this logic, the so-called semi-feudal relations and the peasants' mentality could indeed be seen as leftovers from an earlier period, still active no doubt, but under world historical notice of extinction. All India needed was to create more capitalist institutions and the process of the conversion of the peasants into citizens, and the properly political figure of the personhood would begin. This indeed was Hobsbawm's logic. So this is a typical Marxian logic. As I mentioned, they were into false consciousness. They were pre-modern. Okay, they were not into the kind of a capitalist modernity as characteristic of the modern world, and that is why Hobsbawm and others characterize the ideologies of the poor people, of the people who occupy the lower rungs, as pre-political. However, Guha takes issue with this characterization. In rejecting the category of pre-political, however, Guha insists on the specific differences in the histories of power in the colonial India and Europe. So Guha argues that Indian society was characteristically different from that of the European society, and the people who occupy the lower rung of Indian society, they are under a very specific political and cultural situation, okay, because they are being dominated by other caste and other groups, and that has to be taken into account. This gesture is radical in that it fundamentally pluralizes the history of power in global modernity and separates it from any universal history of capital. So again, we know that a typical Marxian story of human progress is very linear. Okay, it does not really look into the regional differences or cultural context, because all cultural things are kind of in the superstructure, which are a product of economic relations. So they follow certain kind of very standard phases, as we know, from primitive communism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism and then socialism and then to communism. This is what a kind of a crude Marxian understanding of social change. So that Guha takes issue with that kind of a characterization, and then that essentially pluralizes the Marxian narrative. So Hobsbawm's material, Guha writes, is of course derived almost entirely from the European experience, and his generalizations are reshaped in accordance with it. Now, what he says in India is, if we see the colonial formation in India as a case of modernity in which, as Guha argues in introducing Subaltern Studies, the domain of the political is irreducibly split into two distinct logics which get braided together at all the time. Okay, the domain of the political is irreducibly split into two distinct logics which get braided together at the same time. The logic of the formal legal and secular framework of governance, and that of relationships of direct domination and subordination that derive their legitimation from a different set of institutional practices, including those of dharma, which translated as religion. Then Guha's writings help to open up a very interesting problem of the global history of modernity. So Guha says that when it comes to Indian society, Indian society had these two, intervening strands of, strands of relations. One is the kind of one which is, introduced by the colonial modernity, new governance systems, secular in its character, new forms of hierarchy, new forms of, nomenclature and other. Second one was that the kind of a relationships of direct domination and subordination, okay, that existed in India, which derived its legitimacy from religious and cultural resources, including dharma, punya, papa, all these things. And that actually it helped to problematize the unique Indian experience of encountering with modernity. Ultimately, this is a problem of how to think about the history of power in an age when capital and the governing institutions of modernity increasingly develop a global reach. Because when Marx wrote about capitalism, it was more limited in its scope, because he was talking about the European experience mostly. Okay, but in a later context, we are seeing that the canvas is much more broad. It is expanded to a much more larger level. Marx's discussion of capitalist discipline assumed that the rule of capital entailed the transition to capitalist relations of power. Michel Foucault's work shows that if we want to understand the key institutions of modernity that originated in West, the juridical model of sovereignty celebrated in modern Europe political thought has to be supplemented by notions of discipline, biopower and governmentality. Okay, so the very important fundamental ways in which ideas of power was complicated by Michel Foucault's intervention is something again important. Okay, as you know, as we mentioned, Gramsci and Foucault became very important intellectual influences during this particular time. So a more restrictive Marxian notion of modernity and development was complicated much by Foucault's argument that the progress towards modernity has to be seen also as a progress through which the power was exercised in more indirect forms, okay, through governmentality, through biopower, and through different forms of control of sexuality and a host of other things. So that really broadened the whole thing. So Guha claimed that the colonial modernity in India, this supplementation has to include an extra pair of terms, that is domination and subordination. Okay, so that is the most important point that he talked about. The history of colonial India created a domain of political that was heteroglossic in its idioms, irreducibly plural in its structure, interlocking within itself strands of different types of relations that did not make up a logical whole. One such strand, critical to the functioning of the authority in Indian institution, was that of a direct domination and subordination of the subaltern by the elite. So this is a very important argument. So this subordination and domination was a characteristic feature according to Guha that is to be sufficiently theorized. Social domination and subordination of the subaltern by the elite was thus an everyday feature of Indian capitalism in itself. Okay, so the capitalism worked differently in different contexts, and in India it worked also through the forms of domination and then subordination. This was a capitalism of the colonial type. Reading critically some key texts of Marx, Guha argued that modern colonialism was quintessentially the historical condition in which an expansive and increasingly global capital came to dominate non-Western societies without affecting or requiring any thoroughgoing democratic transformation or social relationships of power and authority. So he argued that unlike a total transformation in the social structure that happened in Europe with the advent of capitalism, okay, which thoroughly revolutionized those societies, the entry of capitalism in India was more circumspect. Okay, it was more limited. It was more it was more restricted in its interference. It did not overthrow the existing social structure. Rather, it tried to negotiate through them. So the existing systems that perpetuated subordination and domination continued to exist, and it negotiated to the realm of modernity. As Guha puts it, colonialism could continue as a relation of power in the subcontinent only on the condition that the colonizing bourgeoisie should fail to live up to its own universalizing project. Okay, so colonialism could continue as a relation of power in the subcontinent only on the condition that the colonizing bourgeoisie should fail to live up to its own universalizing project, because the modernity, colonialism also had a universalizing project. But the bourgeoisie was seen as failing to live up to that. So these are the main arguments here. The cultural history of power in Indian modernity could not therefore be produced by a simple application of the analysis of nationalism available to the Western Marxists. So that was the main intervention made by Guha in that context. So next section, Subaltern Studies and Reorientation of History. We are trying to look at what specifically, what were the kind of ramifications of this. Guha's two formulations, that both nationalism and colonialism were involved in instituting in India a rule of capital in which bourgeoisie ideologies exercised dominance without hegemony, and that the resulting forms of power in India could not be termed as pre-political, had several implications for historiography. So these were the two most important fundamental arguments. His argument about the dominance without hegemony, how it provided a dominance but not hegemony. Hegemony would indicate a kind of an absolute control over certain things, but it was more kind of a dominance because it relied on the existing forms of domination and subordination. First of all, Guha's critique of the category of pre-political challenged historicism by rejecting all stagist theories of history. Okay, so stagist theories of history, as we know, the argument that every society undergoes different stages to reach where it is today. Okay, whether it is hunting, gathering, then tribal, primitive, slavery, then feudal, then capitalist, and the present day maybe late capitalist or neoliberal capitalist. So the tendency to argue that every society must go through these specific stages, okay, is something so inherent in the Marxian historiography, or for that matter almost every major theories of social change of Western origin, and that came under heavy criticism by Guha here. As I have discussed, if the terms pre-political, as I have discussed, took its validity from the categorizing certain kinds of power relationships as pre-modern, feudal and so on, Guha's discussion of power in colonial India resists such a clear distinction between modern and pre-modern. Relations in India that looked feudal when seen through the stagist view of history were contemporaneous with all that looked modern to the same point of view. From Guha's point of view, the former could not be looked on through the geological or evolutionist metaphor of survival or remnant without such historicism being elitist in its interpretation of the past. So this was a fundamental argument that the conventional stagist explanation or evolutionary stagist explanation was systematically questioned. So there is no doubt that the Indian political elite internalized and used the language of political modernity, but this democratic tendency existed alongside and interlarded with undemocratic relations of domination and subordination. This coexistence of two domains of politics, said Guha, was the index of an important historical truth, that is the failure of the bourgeoisie to speak for the nation, because the bourgeoisie was not able to come out of their traditional settings and bondages, because they were also part of these larger systems of domination. Guha's emphasized, there was in fact no unitary nation to speak for. Okay, so again this is a very, very important damning argument. A critical stance towards official or statist nationalism and its attendant historiography marked Subaltern Studies from the beginning. Okay, a critical stand towards official or statist nationalism. The very argument of the nationalist historians saying that every section of Indian society, irrespective of whether they are poor or rich, they all cherished an idea of a nation, okay, which looked very romantic, which looked very, very inspiring, was debunked by these scholars. Guha's question for a history in which subaltern was the maker of his own destiny brought into focus the question of relationship between text and power. Historical archives were usually collections of documents, texts of various kinds. Historians of peasants and other subaltern social groups have long emphasized the fact that peasants do not leave their own documents. Okay, so this another very important area of influence of subaltern studies was the relook into the historical documentation. Okay, because subalterns are mostly unlettered people. Okay, they don't leave diaries, they don't record things, they are mostly illiterate, they are mostly unlettered. So somebody else actually document the activities of these people. Okay, and those who document the activities of people would invariably belong to the structures of domination, whether it is upper caste people, or whether it is government officials, whether it is district collectors or British officials. So these are the people who are writing and depicting the actions and thought processes of the people. Okay, so the whole question whether how do we get direct access to subaltern continues to be a very important question. So then the whole question, how do we get access to them? So he talks about a French scholar, Eugene Weber, provides a second formulation in this approach. The illiterate are not in fact inarticulate. They can and they do express themselves in several ways. Sociologists, ethnologists, geographers, and most recently demographic historians have shown us new and different means of interpreting evidence. So this is also the time when this whole historians moved away from the standard way of doing history from the archives and went into oral histories and narratives, and then studies the method that were mostly used by sociologists and then anthropologists. Thomas Thompson and others, that peasants do not speak directly in archival documents which are usually produced by the ruling class. Like them, Guha also uses diversity of disciplines in breaking the logic of peasant consciousness at the time of rebellion. But he thinks of the category of consciousness differently. Okay, look into that. Guha's critique of the term pre-colonial legitimately barred this path of thinking. Guha thought of consciousness and therefore the peasant subjecthood as something immanent in the very practice of peasant insurgency. Okay, so he did not understand the present that the consciousness is articulated separately, or he was against the tendency of looking into the ideology and the practice as two different entities. Elementary aspects is a study of the practice of insurgent peasants in colonial India and not of a reified category called as consciousness. So he argued that they are intermeshed in each other. Guha makes no claim that the insurgent consciousness he discussed is indeed conscious, that it existed inside the heads of the peasants. He does not equate consciousness with the subject's view of himself. He examines rebel practices to decipher the particular relationship between elites and subaltern and between subaltern themselves that are acted out in these practices, and then attempts to derive from these relationships the elementary structures, as it were, of consciousness inherent on those relationships. So he is talking about how, as researchers, we have a possibility to decipher the consciousness through the actions of these people. Okay, because you can't expect of deciphering an independently existing isolated set of ideas as the consciousness of these people. So all these are arguments about the methodological innovations in subaltern studies. Guha therefore emphasized the need for the historians to develop a conscious strategy to reading the archives, not simply for the biases of the elites, but for the textual properties of these documents, in order to get at the various ways in which elites made elite mode of thought represented the refractory figure of the subaltern and their practices. So very important set of interventions in the in the methodology of historiography. Okay, how the archival method that was so far till then were understood in a more mechanical manner was kind of a more problematized. So subaltern studies since 1988, multiple circuits, as I mentioned in the beginning, it went into so many different directions. So in this last section, he talks about that. The influence of Edward Said wrote a foreword to the volume describing Guha's statement regarding the aim of subaltern studies as intellectually insurrectionary. Gayatri Spivak essay Deconstructing Historiography, published earlier in the 6th volume under Guha's editorship in 1986, served as the introduction to this section. This essay, Spivak's, and the review essay by Rosalind O'Halloran, published about the same time, made two important criticisms of the subaltern studies that had a serious impact on the later intellectual projects of the book. Both Spivak and O'Halloran pointed to the absence of gender questions in subaltern studies. So later a host of such studies came into picture. They pointed out in the effect that subaltern studies historiography operated with an idea of the subject to make the subaltern the marker of his own destiny, that had now wrestled at all with the critique of the very idea of the subject itself that had been mounted by post-structuralist thinkers. Spivak's famous essay, Can Subaltern Speak?, a critical and challenging reading of the conversation between Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze, forcefully raised these and related questions by mounting a deconstructive and philosophical objections to any straightforward program of letting the subaltern speak. So this, whether the subalterns can speak, whether is it because by the very term subaltern, the argument that the people who are silenced. So how it all went into more complicated things. And this section about how other scholars, including Ranajit, Guha and Partha Chatterjee, and contributions made by Susi Tharu and others on contemporary feminist theory in India, how it brought in a different direction. And Partha Chatterjee's 1986 book, Nationalist Thought and the Colonial World, creatively applied Saidian and post-colonial perspective to the study of non-Western nationalisms and others. And then Gyanendra Pandey's work, Pandey's book on the construction of communalism in colonial North India, and his essay in defense of the fragments, Chatterjee's 1994 book, The Nation and its Fragments. So it's all about how it all went into different kinds of directions. So in conclusion, this expansion beyond the realms of Indian history has earned for the series both praises and criticism. Much of the controversy follows roughly the contours of the global and ongoing debate between Marxists on the one hand and the postmodernists on the other. Like Marxists elsewhere, Indian Marxists charge that the postmodernist valorization of the fragments in subaltern historiography hurts the cause of the unity of the oppressed. That's a typical Marxian argument. Many of the Marxist opponents of subaltern studies believe that such unity is aided by social analysis that help bring different publics of the oppressed together by finding global and totalizing causes behind their oppression. The debate is complicated further in India by the rise of political power of Hindu fundamentalist parties and organizations. So we will look upon, and he talks about the critique by Ashish Nandi and Partha Chatterjee and T.N. Madan against secularism, how that was seen as a colonial imposition. So all these things. So that's what this essay talks about. As I mentioned, it's an essay that looks into the relationship between colonial, post-coloniality and historiography. An essay that kind of provides you with a summary of this very important intellectual exercise. We will have one more session on subaltern studies, and after that we will have 2 sessions that look into the criticisms, especially from the Marxian school, against subaltern studies. So let me stop here. Thank you.